For many people, the Gospel of Thomas is not the fifth Gospel, but the single solitary Gospel that allows people to remain within the Christian tradition. In this Gospel, there is still a cross, but no blood of a slain deity dripping from it. There is no angry God, no devils, no creed, not even a resurrection. There is Jesus, of course, and from his mouth does not emerge a sword, but waters gushing with life. This Jesus is the light, but not the Logos. He's a mystical revealer, a mystagogue, without an ego. He does not keep pointing to himself as the center and source of salvation. Instead, he points to the selves of other people, helping them realize that they have all the spiritual riches they need within. This Jesus refuses to be called Master or Lord. He refuses even to interpret his own sayings and parables. That too is left to the reader. Salvation is attained not through the wisdom of Jesus, but through the reader's meditation on Jesus' wisdom. A reader response is required. If the reader does not become wise through the sayings, then the voice of Jesus is but a clanging gong. Salvation requires interpretation. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus does not have a story, just sayings. Thomas is a sayings gospel. A gospel is any document containing reports on the life or teachings of Jesus. A gospel is a gospel because its contents are thought to bring salvation. The author of Thomas deliberately chose to record Jesus' sayings with this salvific purpose in mind. He or she made a deliberate choice not to link the sayings by an overarching story. The reader might assume the story of Jesus told in the Synoptic Gospels or in the Gospel according to John, but in the end, it's better to bracket this knowledge, to let Jesus and Thomas speak something new and surprising. I've spoken about the writer of Thomas. Was there only one? Although the written forms of Thomas in antiquity were slightly different, I believe that there was probably a single author or compiler who first put the sayings together at one particular time. This author had a consistent viewpoint, and so put together a coherent collection, even though the sayings seemingly appear at random. I don't subscribe to community authorship, either in the sense that a group composed the text or that a text represents the ideology of a group. Communities are often very idealized groups, imagined as unified in thought and practice. In reality, most groups don't have that kind of unity. At best, an author can represent a larger pattern of thought, but most texts are products of individual creativity. It's truer to say, I think, that Thomas was written to create community, rather than to represent the thoughts of a pre-existent community. For still today, Thomas has the ability to create a community of readers. We've known about some sayings of Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas since the late 19th century. They appeared in Greek on papyri discovered in trash heaps in the town of Oxyrhynchus, over 100 miles south of Cairo. 3 separate papyri attest 3 separate copies of the Gospel of Thomas that were read in Middle Egypt during the 3rd century of the Common Era, and probably earlier. Some conservative scholars have argued that these texts were read privately. Some of the evidence, however, indicates that they were also read aloud in churches. For instance, one of the copies of Thomas was written on a codex and found in the same location as a fragment from the Gospel of Matthew. Another Thomas papyrus has several markings used as reading aids. If Thomas was read in a town of Middle Egypt, then Greek copies of the Gospel probably existed in other, more major cities along the Nile River. The only complete copy of the Gospel of Thomas is a Coptic, that is, Egyptian translation, probably written in the mid to late 4th century. This version, officially labeled the Gospel according to Thomas, represents a version of Thomas in small ways different from the papyri. Thus, when reading Thomas, one should always check the reading of the Greek papyrus fragments. When was Thomas written? Some say that it was written at various stages as a kind of rolling corpus. According to April Deconic, for instance, an early community of Jerusalemite Christians composed the sayings of the gospel as early as 30 of the Common Era, when Jesus was recently dead. As this community migrated, took on new membership, and developed theologically, more and more sayings were added, first orally, until a final edition was produced about 120. This theory is difficult to prove without manuscript evidence prior to about 200. The Coptic version of the text is a translation of a fairly stable document, judging by the Greek papyri. Deconic's method dates earlier editions of Thomas based on the theology of individual sayings, or even clauses within sayings. This is hazardous in my view. Each saying depends on interpretation, after all, and scholars, just like everybody else, differ on the interpretations of the sayings. What seems like a consistent pattern, that Thomasine theology went from apocalypticism to mysticism, might in the end be too simple. A person can believe that the end of the world is both imminent and realized. Truth be told, a compiler could have used or reused Jesus' sayings to create a fresh composition at any time during the late 1st or early 2nd century CE. A more precise dating must be worked out from the content of the gospel itself. According to Thomas saying 71, Jesus said, "I shall destroy this house, and no one will be able to rebuild it." Most interpreters rightly see this as a version of the saying that also appears in John 2, verse 19, and elsewhere, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it." Thomas corrects this saying so that no one will be able to rebuild the temple. Not God, not Jesus, and not the Romans. Why is that? Probably because by the time Thomas was written, hopes for the rebuilding of the temple had been quashed. When was this? To answer this question, we must delve into history. Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed by the Romans in the summer of 70. Between about 75 and 115, at least some Jews hoped for the temple and its sacrifices to be restored. The Jewish author of 2nd Baruch, late 1st or early 2nd century, wrote, "After a short time, Zion, that is Jerusalem, will be rebuilt, and the offerings will be restored, and the priests will again return to their ministry." An Egyptian writer, posing as the Sibyl, spoke of a man from heaven who would make a holy temple exceedingly beautiful in its fair shrine. The author of Barnabas, a fictive Christian letter probably written in Alexandria, expected the Romans or their agents to rebuild the Jewish temple in the early 2nd century. In the year 115, however, a far-reaching Jewish revolt erupted in Cyrene, or North Africa, quickly spreading to Egypt and to Cyprus. The revolt cost many lives, and it poisoned Roman-Jewish relations for at least a generation. The expectation that Rome would rebuild the Jewish temple wavered. Then, in 132, the Emperor Hadrian announced that he would rebuild a temple in Jerusalem, but that it would be a temple to Jupiter. The announcement helped spark the Bar Kokhba revolt, which raged for 3 years in Palestine. Despite the conflict, Hadrian's temple to Jupiter was eventually built, and realistic hopes for a temple to Yahweh were dashed by 135. Accordingly, Thomas saying 71 probably dates to a time after 135, when the truth of Jesus' prophecy was plain to all. If the saying was written as part of a collection, then the entire Gospel of Thomas, at least the version we possess, was written after 135. There are other reasons for dating Thomas, at least to the early 2nd century. These include probable dependence on the Synoptic Gospels, as argued recently by Goodacre and Gathercole. Secondly, rejection of Jewish rituals and of Judaism as such. And three, the use of an apostolic figure to shore up the authority of a gospel. The earliest gospels were probably all anonymous. Only in the 2nd century, when apostolic tradition became important, were most gospels attributed to apostles or apostolic figures. The place of Thomas's composition can probably be determined from those who first quoted it. I believe that the first person to quote a Thomasine saying was Basilides of Alexandria, or one of his followers. Basilides quoted a portion of what now appears as Thomas saying 23, quote, 1 from 1,000 and 2 from 10,000. Basilides said that only 1 from 1,000 knows the powers who appear when the soul ascends to heaven. These powers also appear in Thomas saying 50. Now, Basilides flourished in the reign of Hadrian between 117 and 138. We don't know if the saying Basilides used was already part of the Gospel of Thomas, but if it was, the Gospel likely emerged very soon after the Bar Kokhba War. Basilides and his circle flourished in Alexandria, Egypt. It's possible that the Gospel of Thomas reached him from Palestine or Syria, but it's simpler to think that the Gospel of Thomas itself was written in Egypt, and probably Alexandria specifically. Between 140 and 200 of the Common Era, Syrian writers don't quote directly from the Gospel of Thomas, but Alexandrians do, and they do so very often and very soon after Thomas was written. Julius Cassianus, for instance, was an Alexandrian who flourished between 140 and 160. He quoted what now appears as Thomas saying 27, quote, fast from the world, and this quote was recycled by Clement of Alexandria. Clement's excerpts from Theodotus, based on Valentinian texts likely dating to the mid-2nd century, likely quoted from Thomas saying 114 about the female transferring to the male. And probably toward the end of the 2nd century, the Alexandrian preacher called Marcion quoted and alluded to the Gospel of Thomas several times. Finally, Thomas shares sayings and distinctive characters with the Gospel according to the Egyptians, a text probably composed in mid-2nd century Alexandria. All these exclusively Alexandrian connections lead me to situate the writing of Thomas in Alexandria between about 135 and 150 of the Common Era. This was a time when Gnostic, Encratic, and anti-Judaic teaching was already flourishing in Alexandria. There is no strong reason to think that Thomas was imported from elsewhere, such as Syria, since no other region at this early time shows direct familiarity with Thomasine gospel traditions. Of course, none of this discussion denies that Judas Thomas eventually became a Syrian apostle. It's merely to say that he was also, and somewhat earlier, a figure known in Alexandria. The Gospel of Thomas came to circulate in Syria, but Thomas was never a distinctly Syrian apostle. After all, he would eventually make it to India, where arguably he continues to be best known and venerated to the present day. Beginning in the late 2nd century and beyond, Syria would become known for the ascetic type of Christianity we see in Thomasine literature. In the mid-2nd century, however, this strongly ascetic or Encratite Christianity also flourished in Alexandria, as witnessed chiefly by Cassianus. An Alexandrian or broader Egyptian origin for the Gospel of Thomas is also supported by the Hermetic and mystical themes integrated into the text, since Hermetists largely flourished in Egypt. Granting that the Gospel of Thomas was first composed in Egypt, it was probably first written in Greek, the main literary language of Egypt in the early 2nd century, and this explains how it ended up in multiple copies in a smallish town of Middle Egypt in the 3rd century. In the late 3rd or early 4th century, a Greek version of Thomas was translated into Coptic, or the last phase of the native Egyptian language. This Coptic version found its way further down the Nile at Nag Hammadi, where it was probably transcribed and read in a Pachomian monastery. The transcribers, at any rate, placed the Gospel of Thomas between two other gospel-like texts, the Secret Book or Apocryphon of John and the Gospel of Philip. The Secret Book of John has been called the Gnostic Bible, and like Thomas, it contains secret words of Jesus spoken to an intimate apostle. The Gospel of Philip is, like Thomas, a sayings gospel, usually categorized as a branch of Valentinian Gnosis. The placement of the Gospel of Thomas suggests that, by the 4th century at least, the Gospel of Thomas was being read as a Gnostic gospel. These results raise a number of questions. What do we mean when we speak of a Gnostic gospel? Is there any evidence for Thomas being read Gnostically closer to the time of its composition? And was Thomas originally intended to be a Gnostic gospel, in some sense competing with other, more familiar gospels? To answer these and other questions, I encourage everyone to take my full online course on the Gospel of Thomas. Thank you very much for your support.